My iPhone says we have 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes, I want to thank those of you who have come. I know that this is such a competitive spot in the program. It isn't quite as bad as it was this morning in the program just before lunch, but this is a competitive one, and we'd all like to be able to clone ourselves. So I want to take this little extra minute to thank you for coming to what is not what I regard as a usual presidential session, and you're going to discover why this is the case. As we've heard already in this annual meeting of AERA, we typically, as education researchers, will tell people that we want our work to make change. We want to make change toward more learning, improved opportunities for learners of all ages and in all sorts of places. Many of us tend to target our energies, though, toward those living in poverty, and I suspect that's true of many of you in this room. Here in the U.S., those who are caught also in mixed status families who are now undergoing the tensions of immigration reform come in for special attention by many of us in this room, especially those of us who study literacy, language, and culture. And Guadalupe Valdez was in this room this morning talking on what's happening with ELL in this country. Yet if the truth would be known, most of us would have to say with some conviction, but a great deal of sorrow, that the research we do actually doesn't carry much significant clout toward making the kind of powerful changes we'd like to make, and certainly not in making those changes as comprehensively and quickly as we'd like. Yet we desperately want research that will work, that will be used, that will be applied, and it will influence policy in directions that benefit learners and the whole process of learning. This session has been designed to give us specific ways, quite specific ways to do this. First, however, we may need just a couple of reminders about why now is the time for us to listen and to rethink how and what our research does. We know that in the last 10 years, the percentage of children growing up and living in poverty in this country has grown by 30%. Over 15 million children now live in families that are well under the poverty line. Low-wage jobs have increased 11-fold, think about that for a moment, since 1968. And those low-wage jobs are not livable incomes. And we also know that schools are resegregating before our very eyes with inequities and inequivalence everywhere we look. The question is what to do. Our speakers are here to tell us what to do, how we can get our research to them to further what they do in their positions, and how we can bring our research into new forms and into new combinations of ways that will help them in their work. Now let me introduce them. Opening the session is Allison R. Brown, who was voted last year one of the top 40 attorneys under 40. She has worked throughout her entire career in civil rights. At Harvard Law School, she was articles editor of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. She has been a trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, working there to enforce Title IV and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, and other laws designed to protect the rights of individuals in relation to public education. Currently, she hosts the online radio show, which I strongly recommend, called Know It All, the ABCs of Education. Most important for us today is her role in making clear that the U.S. offers no protection for those who live in poverty. Now note that this is in distinction to what happens in England and many of the other developed economically progressive countries. Poverty is not a protected class, such as those affected by the legislation that I noted above. This point, above all, explains why those living in poverty are left behind and discriminated against with such widespread consequences. Allison, thank you for coming and for offering us reason to believe that the legal system will and can use education research to help make a difference for the unprotected, those who live in poverty. Our second speaker is Robert Atkins, and I'm going to have them just bridge seamlessly, who is Dean of the School of Nursing and Associate Professor of Nursing and Childhood Studies at Rutgers University. He'll tell you how his experiences with young people on the streets of Camden, New Jersey, led him first to found a nonprofit youth development program dedicated to the physical and educational health of urban youth. This work led him to the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University. He, like Allison, is dedicated to bringing change to the effects of urban poverty on child and adolescent development. He believes education research has a forceful role to play in his efforts in the medical world, and he is going to enlist our help. Following our speakers, we will again seamlessly transition to my colleague Steve Reeder from Portland State, who will give us what I call the charge to action. This session will not have questions at the end. We've all sat through those uncomfortable moments where the clock ticks and a few people come up and ask, but we will be around afterwards if you have questions. What our charge will be that comes from Steve is for him to push us to go out of here and to do what they have asked us to do. That is, provide research that becomes product and process that will give opportunities to those in perhaps the toughest situation in this country, those growing up in poverty. And they will tell us, all three of them, how to find a way to move those children into the lifelong learning process. Allison? Your script, I wouldn't do it all.
Thank you. So I want to thank Dr. Heath for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I want to talk to you as an advocate. I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak to you researchers. I want to talk to you about working together, advocates and researchers, to help the world get to where it needs to be for students living in poverty by developing a new advocacy framework. As an attorney at the Department of Justice, when I requested research, it was for a very limited purpose: to, in a specific case, compile and study data and information and put forth expert testimony that had implications only for the individuals or systems involved in that particular case. Education-focused research with more far-reaching impact can help to inform advocacy priorities, develop strategy around those priorities, support advocacy for implementation of those priorities, and illuminate additional research needs. As the litigation strategy in Brown versus Board of Education has revealed, research is critical to convince courts and communities of an equity-focused agenda. Advocates are developing a language of equity for students who live in poverty, similar to the language historically used in race discussions. And research is needed to help shape rhetoric around poverty in education and to support emerging advocacy efforts that will articulate why it is important to talk about poverty in education and how we do that in a way that is respectful and meaningful. Before we outline a new framework, let's talk about one that we know well: the Race in Education Framework. As you know, the federal collection of civil rights-related data in education has expanded to include unprecedented levels of data and information. In the Civil Rights Data Collection, released by the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, this has electrified advocacy efforts to bring equity to students of color and students with disabilities. All of a sudden, advocates have had access to data and information on a scale that we've never before seen, and we are anxious for more, to share with communities, to validate perceived injustice. I wrote recently about a young man and a young woman, both of whom were popular high school students and both of whom were killed in their prime. They didn't know each other. He lived in DC, she lived in Iowa. I drew the parallels. Their friends demonstrated their grief by making T-shirts with the dead children's likenesses and names, and they packed their funerals to pay respects. In life, they both were talented, he as a musician and she as an athlete. He was black and was shot dead for his shoes. She was white and was killed when her motorbike struck a tree. His death was barely a blip in the local newspaper, and hers made national news. HBO Real Sports even did a segment. We afford certain children an assumption of childhood purity and privilege that we do not allow other children. Death at the age of 18 or 19 is not something that we should expect. And for some children, it shocks our conscience so much that even national media outlets have to stop and take some time to focus on just that. For other children, it is what we expect, that they will die a violent death before they reach maturity. There is nothing in this example that would violate federal civil rights law. And yet there is a level of humanity that is missing still for too many children. Not grieving the same for the black boy gunned down in the streets of D.C. as we do for the white girl who's killed on her motorbike is not against the law. But there is something wrong there. And this is where the race and education framework has fallen short, in changing mindsets. And this is why the civil rights data collection's expansion and release were so celebrated. Data like that is the missing link, the thing that can change minds. Race in this country is a sickness that has been left to fester, and we have to understand the history of racial advocacy in this country in order to craft a working framework for poor students. Let's look at race in the courts. First, an important distinction. The terms desegregation and integration, as I'm sure you know, in the legal arena at least, are not necessarily the same thing. Desegregation is the government-supervised removal of segregation and the entire process that entails. Integration is more of a social construct and is usually what schools mean in valuing diversity. It is proactive rather than prohibitive and is people engaging meaningfully with one another across social lines of separation. No discussion about desegregation or integration can really take place without talking about the Brown versus Board of Education line of cases, which are a key building block in the race and education framework. Brown and its progeny, like this one, Green, imposed an affirmative obligation on school districts to desegregate and began to force movement that was slowly integrating schools. Desegregation is now a slow grind, and any small bit of momentum gained immediately following Brown has been reversed in many places. But as we consider creating a new framework for students in poverty, it is worth thinking about the strategy that brought us Brown versus Board. The notion behind the Brown legal strategy was to utilize the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution as a tool to completely eliminate separate but equal and eventually move to true equality for all. Brown is not that ultimate ideal, but it is one brick on the yellow brick road to equity. In order to overturn separate but equal, the Brown legal team had to demonstrate that even when all else was equal, the plaintiff children, black children, suffered. And so, the opinion in Brown is built on the illusory premise of white superiority. The question that the Supreme Court answered in the affirmative was whether racial segregation deprives, quote, children of the minority race of equal educational opportunity even when everything else was equal. The buildings, the resources, everything except the children sitting behind the desks. The court considered the, quote, detrimental effect of segregation on the black plaintiffs and guiltily explored the, quote, sense of inferiority that black children must carry as a result of segregation. But there is no discussion in the opinion of the detrimental effects of segregation on white children, or that black and white students are, as human beings, equal, and thus entitled to equal treatment under the law. Of the opinion, Zora Neale Hurston wrote, "The whole matter revolves around the self-respect of my people. How much satisfaction can I get from a court order for somebody to associate with me who does not wish me near them? I regard the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court as insulting rather than honoring my race." Charles Hamilton Houston was the architect of the legal strategy that brought us the Brown opinion, and I believe he was getting there, building to full equity with the legal tools that he had available to him. But he died in 1950 4 years before the first Brown opinion was written, and Thurgood Marshall, Houston's protege, was appointed to the Second Circuit in 1961, and to the Supreme Court in 1967, where he was promptly marginalized, relegated to the world of writing painfully beautiful dissenting opinions, especially in the social justice context. Brown is a victory, but it is not the end of the story of race in this country. We were supposed to keep going. We were supposed to keep building. And let's remember that Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark were the social scientists that worked alongside the Brown legal team to craft a story based in social science that would bring about the Brown victory such as it was. Desegregation and integration as we know them have suffered significant losses in the courts. So has the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in 2007, the Supreme Court in the Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District case essentially took voluntary racial integration off the table for public schools by saying that schools cannot take race into account in developing plans to voluntarily integrate. Although this opinion does not apply to schools that are under a desegregation order, desegregation law has been so whittled away that this is an effective death knell for Brown. And now we await a Supreme Court decision in Fisher versus the University of Texas, which very well may decide whether diversity in higher education is even a compelling interest. This was the sliver of an opening that the court left behind in the Seattle decision, that racial diversity is still a compelling interest. As Shirley said, our schools are resegregating, and no one is allowed to utter the word race or integration. And although we know integration is a proven strategy, one that for certain benefits all segments of society, we can't talk about it. Schools seem to have no choice but to go back to the status quo. The dirty little secret is that Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is now effectively the law of the land for far too many students. Many of the courts that are considering desegregation cases, seeing no other option, do a cursory review of school districts for equality between the all-black schools and the all-white schools, making sure that facilities, course offerings, teacher qualifications, even computers and books between all-black schools and all-white schools are somewhat equal. Meanwhile, according to the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, low-income students of color are increasingly enrolled in segregated schools. What if we had it to do all over again? What if we had the chance, as we do now with poverty, to clearly focus on the distinction between equity, which is based on deeply and accurately assessed needs and desired outcomes, rather than equality, meaning that we all get the same thing regardless of anything else? What if we were to make equity our foundation, rather than any notion of superiority? And what if we started with student voice? Well, what are the lessons that we've learned? Think about the bitterness engendered by desegregation efforts, the busing of students all over town, the closure of mostly black schools, dispersing and termination of black teachers. Why would we want to revisit that? Why not pursue separate but equal? There are, after all, pockets of success for some segregated schools. But we have to keep in mind what it was about separate but equal that could not work in this country: systemic and institutionalized racism and bias. The same is true for students of any race living in poverty and our expectations of them. For example, in Washington, D.C., where I live, there are a few top-performing charter schools that are all or nearly all free reduced lunch. There seems to be a perception in the city that these schools are not for middle and high-income students, and not just that they want to reserve the seats for low-income students and thus middle-class families are not welcome, but that the education being delivered is fundamentally different, that somehow low-income children need an altogether different educational experience than middle-class children or high-income children to succeed academically. This is where we need your help. advocates kind of scratch our heads and ruminate over instinctual thought that there's something there to address, research will let us know what direction to take. The law cannot operate in a vacuum to ensure equal rights for all students. Neither can social science. Where would Charles Hamilton Houston have gone next? I believe he would continue to look to researchers, social scientists, just as I am looking to you today. Many times, discussions about education reform intentionally conflate race and class. Because the federal courts have slowly closed the courthouse doors to claims of race discrimination in education and almost completely prohibited voluntary efforts to create racial diversity in schools, equity proponents have been forced into an untenable position, using socioeconomic status as a proxy for race. This often leaves educators, community members, and others thinking about poverty only in terms of race. Social science can help equip us all with the necessary tools to navigate between the overlapping worlds of race and poverty in education so that we can tailor our advocacy efforts for students based on their unique needs. It is undeniable that socioeconomic status and race are inextricably linked, but they are not the same. Research has demonstrated that even controlling for poverty, racial disparities in academic performance remain. This is a symptom of this country's seemingly intractable racial illness, which is different from the country's relationship with money and class. Additionally, students living in poverty are not subject to the same constitutional protections as students based on race. And that may be a good thing, because we have the space now to develop strategies, such as socioeconomic integration, that are no longer permissible in the race context. Michelle Alexander, in her tremendous work, The New Jim Crow, talks about the, quote, racial bribe that drove a wedge between poor whites and poor blacks, beginning with slavery, and has kept that division in place over generations. The time is ripe for a new advocacy framework, and research can help separate race and poverty in our minds by fleshing out the differences while also bridging racial gaps. Research can help build a new strategy for equity, one that is free from judicial scrutiny and one that, given the population of low-income students, is designed to meet the needs of the majority. So how do we formulate a new advocacy framework for students living in poverty? A framework that is actually right in line with global efforts to ensure that all children, no matter their means, have access to a high-quality education. First, let's examine our beliefs, our starting point, which are so important in framing areas of research inquiry and advocacy strategies too. Changing mindsets means reversing beliefs that poor people have less money and thus are lesser in every respect, that poor children are the unteachables. Many educators have been exposed to this culture of poverty myth, a myth that has summarily relegated a group of people, children and their families, to a category of unworthiness, and then define them as a group who supposedly don't care about education and don't value education. This gives others permission to judge that group unfavorably, attempt to erase their identity, and ultimately try to assimilate them to the so-called dominant culture of white, affluent mainstream. We have seen this before. In Native American schools, the first slide says, still being separated from their families, Native Americans are stripped of their culture and religion by schools. The second slide is for a Japanese internment camp. Many people also believe that poverty is somewhat fluid, meaning that eventually you can attain the American dream. This makes it even easier to place blame on people who live in poverty for their circumstances. Enough already with the negative and the blame. Do not let bias be the starting point for your research. There is no culture of poverty. And beginning with deficiency as an assumption is dangerous to build research from. It is how we end up with the bell curve and other research that has only deepened entrenched prejudice. Advocates need solutions, Not more research about the failures of students by category, not more research about the shortcomings of the communities and parents who are raising children in difficult circumstances. That is the wrong starting point. Perhaps another wrong starting point is this idea of individuality. Every man for himself, I've got mine, good luck getting yours. With poverty rates growing and student achievement across strata suffering, we are all in a sinking boat. There may be a hole on only one side of that boat, but we all have an obligation to plug the hole. Once our starting point is properly calibrated, we have to know the numbers. The National Center for Children in Poverty statistics indicate that 22% of children under 18, or 16.1 million children, live in poverty, meaning a family of four makes less than $22,350 per year. In schools, to measure the number of students living in poverty, we examine the students who receive free and reduced price lunch. This is not the best measure of student poverty because it is an optional enrollment program and all students who may qualify are not necessarily taking advantage. However, the New York Times reported in 2011 that the number of subsidized school lunches rose from 18 million in 2006-2007 to 21 million in 2010-11. The Department of Education noted that 52% of fourth graders in 2010 received free reduced lunch as compared with 49% in 2009. And in June of last year, the Department of Education revealed that for the first time in history, American schools reported more than 1 million homeless students. Here are the numbers by race. The National Center for Children in Poverty says, although Black, American Indian, and Hispanic children are disproportionately low income, whites comprise the largest group of all low-income children, which NCCP has defined as twice the poverty rate. And Hispanics make up the largest group of poor children under 18 years old. As you can see, 13% of white children live in poverty, 39% of Black children, 13% of Asian children, 36% of American Indian children, and 34% of Hispanic children. Seeing these numbers, it is apparent that there is a tremendous amount of good that we can do together for so many children of all races when we focus our efforts on poverty. And that is precisely the direction that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was headed when he was assassinated. He called poverty a curse akin to cannibalism. So how can advocates, educators, youth, communities, and researchers work together to change the law, mindsets, and circumstances and create a new framework of advocacy around poverty and education? Research to advocacy should begin from an assumption of competence about the population you are studying. Let me tell you a story. There's a group of high school seniors that meets weekly for a group counseling session with their counselor in one of the English classrooms. The school is almost 100% free reduced lunch. Recently, one of the students in the group, an 18-year-old senior, shared with his counselor in the group that he and his friends had made plans to borrow his uncle's RV and drive across the country from the East Coast here to California after graduation in celebration of their achievements. While he was telling his story, the English teacher walked into the classroom, and when the student was finished, the teacher, in disbelief, proclaimed loudly to the student and in front of everyone there, "Drive across the country? You can't do that. You have neither the money nor the education to do something like that." He then turned to the counselor and scolded the counselor for encouraging such thoughts in the child. As I said previously, we afford certain children a level of purity in their childhood that we do not grant other children. Driving across the country, even sailing around the world, is a rite of passage for some children once they have attained some societal measure of success, like graduating from high school. This child's educator told him that his education wasn't sufficient for him to get from one end of the country to the other end of the very same country. What does that tell us about that teacher's starting point? The belief system he held about his students in the first place. Again, there is nothing about that situation that would violate federal civil rights law. Not believing that a child living in poverty is capable of taking a cross-country trip isn't against the law, but it is deplorable because of the mind state from which it comes. You, as researchers, can show us our human connections, which is critical to changing mindsets. You can show us how our perceptions of each other are flawed. Research like Philip Goff's in perception and implicit bias is important. Research such as his can show us what we wrongly perceive of those living in poverty. Have discussions with the people in the community to make sure that you are capturing individual experiences in a sensitive way before examining perception. Make sure that you have adequately perceived people first, that you are incorporating children in under-resourced schools in developing your measurement tools. That way, you can help us to separate perception from reality, as has been done with some success in the race arena. For instance, the now well-formed movement against zero-tolerance student discipline policies that exacerbate racial disparities in student discipline and student outcomes has gained momentum in large part because of the work of researchers like Dr. Russ Skiba and others who have demonstrated that black boys are disproportionately suspended from school because of the perception that they behave worse, not because they actually do. Through your research, we can examine media portrayals and popular perceptions and definitions of the poor in order to temper our sympathy/superiority and humanize the so-called other. When our perceptions are correct, we can move mountains and do for poor children what research on race has sought to accomplish. First, in the race context, there are studies to demonstrate that students of color are eligible for advanced placement courses at the same rate as whites, but are not counseled to enroll in AP courses and are not participating in AP courses at the same rate. This may also be true for low-income students. Second, research has demonstrated that there are several educational spheres of overlap for children of color. For example, black students are overrepresented in particular categories of special education. Similarly, research about low-income students will demonstrate that there are areas of overlap for students in poverty. One area of overlap is safety and security. A 2011 study by Aaron Kupchik and Jeff Ward found that the placement and location of school security, police officers, metal detectors, even police dogs, is related to students' race and socioeconomic status. They found that poverty is a significant predictor of the use of security measures, not actual criminal behavior. Next, qualitative research cannot be discounted. Anecdotal stories are very effective at changing mindsets. I'll tell you another story. A mother shared with me that her son was constantly being suspended from school because of his disability that caused him to laugh and smile at inappropriate times, such as when he was being reprimanded by his teacher. This mother and her children were homeless and spent their nights sleeping in friends' homes or in shelters. Not only was her son constantly suspended for smiling at supposedly inappropriate times, her daughter had been suspended for wearing the wrong uniform to school. The girl's classroom got cold and her one sweater was the wrong color blue. She was suspended out of school for putting it on. Her mom couldn't afford another sweater, and there was no program in the school district to ensure that children living in poverty had access to the clothes they needed to comply with the district's rigid school uniform policy. Part of changing minds is that people must know these stories. What I know in my heart and what your research can prove is that if these two children had been affluent or middle class, the adults in the building would have fallen over themselves to address their needs. Research can help us to make that true too for children living in poverty. In telling stories, we have to seek out and share success stories. We must all be concerned about the dangers of Claude Steele's stereotype threat and of creating self-fulfilling word trenches from which children and families find it difficult to extract themselves. Children will be what they see and understand themselves to be, so we have to tell a better story for their sake. American Promise is a documentary following two black male students into the halls of Dalton, an elite private school in New York. Negative mindsets created by the ubiquitous negative stories that we see and hear every day about black men and boys greeted those children at the schoolhouse door and forced the boys to struggle with internalized perceptions of themselves. It wasn't enough to just let them into the school, but mindsets had to change. Dr. Ivory Toldson has conducted research that debunks black myths. For example, he has demonstrated that more black men are in college than in prison, which is not the narrative that is told in the mainstream. The same type of research with accompanying stories about children living in poverty is necessary. Poor families are overwhelmingly loving, supportive, hardworking, and brilliant. Let's tell that story. Finally, research has to unveil corporate interests in unproductive methods so that we can unlock minds that are wedded to policy proposals because they sound good. Kind of like the charter versus traditional public school debate that is so distracting. Let's investigate where private dollars are being spent. We know that testing companies make millions. Corporate interests place blame on teachers for perceived student failures. Lobbyists are interested in placing more security in schools. Research can follow the money so that we can ensure that the things we know work well for student success can receive the necessary support. So what do we know that works? We need research about solutions, the things that work in any school, private, parochial, public, charter, so that we can encourage replication. For example, we now know that music and art have a positive impact on the brain, and replacing security guards with art instructors works to engage students and improve performance, as happened in Boston at the Orchard Gardens School, where the principal fired the security guards and replaced them with art instructors. 90% of the school's students live at or below the poverty line, and some are homeless. Discipline incidents are down. Attendance and student performance are up. We also know for certain that early childhood education, quality extended learning opportunities, as Robert Atkins will discuss, meaningful parent engagement, and integration and diversity work for all students. We know that conditions for learning are important, which means that all students need an environment with high expectations, where they are engaged and challenged, where their natural ability and inclination to learn is nurtured rather than redirected or extinguished, and where they are treated with respect. We know that wraparound services, community services to support schools, will work for student success. We know mentoring programs may be successful when pairing students who live in poverty with an adult in the school building who can identify with their experience. We also know that history matters. Howard Zinn and his People's History of the United States is an excellent example of a relevant history tool for children living in poverty. I've heard too many children ask who Jim Crow was and what Martin Luther King Jr. did to end slavery. Imagine instead a connection to history that empowers students to see themselves shaping their own reality and the future of our society. And near and dear to my heart, let's also study entrepreneurship, another viable teaching tool to engage students and empower them. It's also important to examine not just how schools should deal with students who are living in poverty, but how we can eradicate poverty altogether. Research can identify the systems and structures in place that perpetuate poverty and are barriers to educational opportunity for students living in poverty. Research can help us to understand what children living in poverty experience, translating for parents who may not speak English, working jobs to support their families, avoiding dangerous activity just walking to and from school each day, stress. 1 in 3 urban youth display symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They are twice as likely as soldiers from Iraq to experience PTSD, except theirs is ongoing. And research will be critical in eliminating concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty has impacted government decisions to close schools. The Opportunity to Learn campaign at the Schott Foundation released this infographic showing that school closures in Chicago will affect 94% low-income students, 82% low-income students in New York City, and 93% low-income students in Philadelphia. My town, D.C., isn't on here, but the school system is currently facing a lawsuit for its decision to close schools. And there are numerous studies about the effects of concentrated poverty on the brain. This research can inform further research about poverty and education. So what we learned from desegregation is that the law alone isn't enough. We have to permanently change systems, and we have to change mindsets. Building a movement, give us the data that we need to make the case for these solutions and others that we may not see, that may not have been tested. Building a movement will take students, educators, parents, communities, and researchers all working as advocates. This movement is continuing where Martin Luther King Jr. and Charles Hamilton Houston were stopped. This movement is not just a black or white movement, not just an advocates or researchers movement, not just a teachers and students movement. It is not us versus them or them versus us. It is and must be all of us together. Rather than working piecemeal and moving feverishly from one so-called reform to another, we need to think strategically about what will have the most positive impact on the children most in need. So what are advocates doing to build this movement? Whether it's creating a new protected class of citizens under the law, developing regulations to protect students living in poverty that are detailed and affirmative like the IDEA, informing communities of your work, organizing sit-ins in wealthy schools and community-led protests of school closures in the poorest neighborhoods, preparing testimony for school board hearings and meetings, uniting rival street gangs and neighborhood community organizations around a common purpose of demanding high-quality education for all of our children, or the like. Your equity-based and equity-focused research will be the foundation of this movement. As I conclude, I have to think out loud about what I want for my own children. I want high-quality education with vigor rather than rigor. I want a connection to the school as a parent. And I want my children to be allowed to be children with the freedoms granted by the developmental intricacies that we know childhood entails. It is what we all want for our children. If the recent tragedies in Boston, in Newtown, on the streets of Chicago, and all over this country have taught us nothing else, we know with absolute certainty that we all are human. We have more in common than not. We all bleed, we all fear, we all cry and hurt and grieve. The same goes for all of our children. Advocates, researchers, educators, students, communities, we all can see where the world needs to go, and we have to work together to help it get there. A trip across the country is to be celebrated, period. A life cut short is to be mourned, period. We have so much work to do, and we can do it well only if we work together. Please, let's get to it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Shirley for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference. For those of you that haven't had the opportunity to have dinner with Shirley, make it a point to do that before you die, because I just met her last night, and it's probably the best dinner of my life with Allison, and she'll probably support me on that, but it was a lot of fun. So obviously a lot of this conference is around poverty, and I think Allison really touched on some more important pieces of it, and I hope to kind of amplify on some of what she talked about. I'll just give you an overview. We're going to talk about my background. I'm a school nurse, co-founder of a youth development program, and an animal researcher. And I'd like to talk a little about the age structure and how that influences youth development activities. And then talk a little about what we know that works. So in 1994, I graduated from nursing school, and as you can imagine, being a school nurse is not what most people expected. When they walked into the office and see me sitting there, I was about 26 years old, and I didn't look like the typical school nurse. But it was at East Camden Middle School, and I had the privilege of being around 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and every day was a roller coaster ride. I never wanted to miss a day. I think in the 4 years that I was a school nurse, I probably missed like 2 or 3 days because you'd miss too much. There's too much going on. And I learned a lot about Camden. I learned a lot about high poverty urban neighborhoods. I learned a great deal about adolescence. I really learned a lot about adolescent girls. Adolescent girls would talk my ear off. They'd come in, big group of them, come sit in my office, and I'd learn everything. I'd learn who likes who, what teacher's cute. I'd learn everything. And then I also learned about these adolescent boys, and they would come in completely different. They'd come in, they'd have their hoods on, they look very tough, but as soon as they came in the office, they'd sit down. It'd always be one-on-one. They would never come in with a group, just be one-on-one. They'd take the hood off, and they would talk my ear off too. I mean, these adolescent males that look so tough, and you could just kind of sense there was this hunger for that opportunity to kind of just talk to a non-parental male, a non-parental person, a non-parent, and just kind of unload. And they unloaded. And I learned so much about what's going on in their lives and factors influencing them. And I also learned about kind of the neighborhoods that they live in. And kind of the first thing that I learned when I started working as a school nurse, I lived in a neighboring suburb. And so I drive outside the city every day at around 3:30. And I was struck by the number of kids after school that were just hanging out. I mean, just, 6th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders, high school students just hanging out in the street. I could not believe, what's going on here? This was so, I grew up in, relatively middle-income, affluent suburb, but after school, there wasn't any hanging out. We had things to do. I had papers to deliver, I had leagues to play in, I had CCD to go to. I hated CCD. I had a million things to do, but there was no just hanging out, and I was just struck by it. And so I had, in my previous life before I became a nurse, I played soccer in college, and so I knew a little about that. So I said, I'll have a little after-school soccer thing, and I'll just, I went to a field, had a couple kids, started out with maybe 10 kids. Within a month, I had 50 kids. I said, what am I doing? I don't know anything about this. And so I went and I enlisted a good friend and a colleague of mine now. His name is Dan Hart. He's a developmental researcher. And I said, I'm out in this field with these kids in Camden, and he was at Rutgers, and I was, obviously coming from East Camden Middle School. I said, I'm out in this field with these kids with Camden, and I need, maybe you can help me to kind of study these kids, figure out what's going on here. In the same way I'm kind of talking to you guys right now, I said, I don't really know what I'm doing. Maybe we can get some data on them. We can get some funding. And he said, yeah, sure. That sounds interesting. He's like, I'll do that with you. I'd be glad to do that. But I'd also like to help you. And Dan came, and we kind of developed to this kind of youth development program. So, yeah, there was soccer. But there's also some community service. We did some academic enrichment. We did a summer camp. Every year we said these kids should have a camp experience. And so we would load them up every summer for 15 years and take them to Vermont. And we rented out this, it's a ski academy. So it's Burke Mountain Academy up in East Burke, Vermont, and we'd have the campus, and the kids would go there, and we'd go there, and we would have 40 kids, and it would, it took 10, 15 years off my life going up there, doing that every summer. But we had a great time. We learned a lot about the adolescents. We learned a lot about kind of what's going on in their lives. We learned about health. We learned about kind of the lack of opportunities they have to kind of develop. And I guess one of the things I was really struck by really early on was, in talking to these kids in the same way that Allison kind of talked about it, you realize these kids had the same aspirations for healthy, constructive adulthoods that I did growing up. And they were no different. They wanted to have an interesting job. They wanted to drive cross country. They wanted to be able to raise a family. They wanted to live in a safe neighborhood. They wanted all the things that I wanted. And it was really kind of struck by, what's going on here that these kids that are so much like me, where are they going off the rails? What's going wrong here in Camden and places like Camden? And I got really interested in that. And one of the things that we really kind of also struck us was that Camden and places like Camden are, kids are spending a lot of time with other kids. They're spending a lot of time in the presence of other kids. These non-parental adults that these students used to be so hungry for when they came into my nurse's office just obviously aren't present. And like this quote says, tell me with whom you walk and I'll tell you who you are. It did tell us a lot about who they are. Because they spent a lot of time with the kids. And when you spend a lot of time with kids through social influence theory, you know what kids know. and kids know a lot about new dances, dressing, internet, things like that. They don't know anything about financial aid forms, SATs, how to go to the dentist, all these kinds of things that parents and non-parental adults know. And we got really interested in kind of figuring this out and looking at these and all this time the kids were spending with each other and what impact it might have on them. And we started looking at some research, started looking at census data. And these communities like Camden are what we refer to as child dense. They're very youthful. We have a lot of kids under the age of 18. They're much more child dense than the community that my kids grew up in or that I grew up in right now. And this child density is very highly correlated with poverty. And we did some research on it. There's actually some long ongoing economic and political kind of connections to child density, what happens in societies and revolutions. So sometimes it's been referred to as youth bulges, but basically child density, the fraction of kids that are represented in the population. So you can see on the first pie chart, that's Cherry Hill. Cherry Hill is a suburb outside of Philadelphia. That's where I grew up. And you can see that about 23% of the population is under the age of 18. 77% obviously is adult. In Camden, about 31 to 69%. And it may not strike you as a big difference, 23% versus 31%, one child per 3 adults versus one child per 2 adults. But we think there's good reason to believe that this is really an important kind of difference, and for a couple reasons. And I'll touch on the first one, is that when you think about the adults in Camden, they're also younger than adults in other places. They're younger. They have less education. They have less likelihood of working a non-traditional job, a 9-to-5 job. They're more likely to be not in the position to go and volunteer and kind of provide the kinds of things that are important in communities or important in the kind of communities that you grew up in, where you were surrounded by adults that were the coaches and the youth leaders and the the parents that were kind of organizing things in the community that were able to kind of build on the collective advocacy and social capital of neighborhoods. I mean, that's not really occurring there. And I think you probably know that, William Julius Wilson talked about this a lot in his work. What happens in these communities like Camden, when blacks were able to move out of these communities in places like Camden. When you used to be in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of blacks were living there. They were living in communities where the accountants and the teachers and the professionals were in the community and they were able to contribute to the community. But when they left, they took with them all those resources. They took with them those after-school programs and those little leagues. And so, for example, in Camden, there's one little league. There's one little league in a city of 70,000 people. In my town, Cherry Hill, we have 4 different little leagues. And these little leagues are huge operations. I mean, they're enormous. I mean, manicured fields, hundreds of adults that are giving substantial amounts of time to just produce like this opportunity for these kids to get a great experience. And sometimes I think we kind of forget like how important these adults are. So you can see this adult ratio in Camden, like I touched on. There's one child, 2 adults, and you can see in that kind of situation, kids are going to spend more time in the company of other kids. And you can see in Cherry Hill, they're going to spend more time around adults. They're just going to bounce more off adults. What do adults have? Adults have information, knowledge, material support. They can help you do the things. So if you want to drive across country, if you want to take the recreation vehicle to drive across country, they can tell you about how to look at the maps and how much gas you're going to need and help you kind of think about how you're going to have to plan that trip out and do those kinds of things that are going to give you this great opportunity. And that's not going to happen in a place like Camden. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. Also, when kids are spending a lot of times in the presence of their peers, we know there's looser social controls. We know that non-normative health behaviors are more likely to be engaged in, just because they're spending more time with the kids, and kids will tell you kind of, oh, that's okay. And as a nurse, and we've done some research looking at kind of what kids know. A lot of it is just they don't really necessarily have the kind of health literacy because they're not in the presence of adults who can help them and model that. And LaRoe's, Annette LaRoe in her work Unequal Childhoods actually touched on some of that work, I think in a very interesting way when she looked at race and class and kind of broke it down by class and looked at the way that middle income and affluent parents were able to help their kids understand how to interact with these institutions, the educational institution, the healthcare institution, and where they were able to kind of be more of have more of a voice as opposed to kind of sitting there and being passive. And as a pediatric nurse practitioner, I've seen that difference. I've seen where you have parents who are able to come in there and allow their kid to be part of the process, and parents just come in there and just sit there and just, okay, the health institution is going to tell me what to do. And obviously as a healthcare provider and as educational practitioners, we want a back and forth. We want this kind of reciprocal transaction to occur where we learn what your needs are, you learn kind of what we're trying to get to, we kind of work together with a more teamwork approach. But it doesn't happen in these kind of communities where these kids aren't given the opportunity to kind of go in there and engage in that kind of fashion. We also know that peers also have a kind of a negative influence on the attitudes of their peers. So there are a lot of problems with peers being in the presence of their peers. And like I said, peers are fun, but they don't organize little leagues. They're not able to kind of help kids. They're not able to kind of bring together the social capital of the community. They're not able to kind of teach their same age peers very much. And so we have this kind of disconnect between where we want kids to be and what's happening. And I think part of the reason why this is important is because, yeah, we talk about poverty. I mean, we talk about this idea of poverty, but I think sometimes we forget that, it's more than just low income, right? I mean, it's more than just not having the money. We have to think about kind of the mechanisms that allow us to understand, why does poverty matter? And what I saw in Camden, poverty matters because there's this high correlation with this child density, right? This age structure. And this age structure gets in the way of all these kinds of things that we know to be important, right? Because if we are in a community where we're not able to kind of, for example, provide kids with the opportunity to go engage in community service. We know there's a connection, association between community service and community service when they become adults, with voting, with getting politically engaged. So if they do that early, if we're able to structure it, as we are in communities that are more affluent, communities that are less child dense, where we're able to kind of have them ask the questions and be able to engage in this process, then we're going to get better outcomes. And these outcomes are so important when we look at communities like Camden, where what we do need are adults who are civically engaged. Unfortunately, on the front side of things, upstream, we're not giving them the opportunities. We're not giving them the opportunities where they can kind of get civically engaged, get feedback, have people that are modeling this behavior, telling them to be part of this process. And so then we say, well, what happened? Then we kind of get, when they're 25 years old, right, they're not engaged, they're not connected. And then we kind of throw our hands up and like, oh man, we just lost another generation. And so it's frustrating. So what we try to do in this, what we call the STAR program in Camden, was a micro program. I mean, it was a small program. What became really surprising to me was when I first started the program, I thought it was going to be really a question of getting enough money to run the program. I said, that's going to be my real challenge. But not a challenge at all. I had plenty of people write me a check. We had plenty. I still have money in our account. We stopped doing this 2 years ago after 15 years, and I still have money. People would always write us a check for what we were doing. That was the problem. The problem is getting adults in the community to come out and participate in that and be part of that. And I think as researchers, you really have to figure out how do we kind of make these kind of changes. And you kind of see some programs where, they're trying to be comprehensive. For example, what Jeffrey Kane is doing in Harlem. I mean, he is trying to take this kind of big circle approach and cover all the bases. But that's hard. And we really saw that up close in Camden, where, for example, I told you that we took kids to Vermont for a week every summer. And the first year we took them there, we sent home permission slips, and we said, look, we had a bus. We knew we were going to take around 40 kids. And we expected that, these parents are going to want to come out and meet us, right? These parents are going to want to come out and see who's taking their kids away for a week. But, the morning that we're supposed to take off, we go to the field, we had 3 parents there. There were 3 parents. 40 kids, but 3 parents like actually came out and put eyes on us. And I can't emphasize anymore. I'm not suggesting these parents didn't care. I'm not saying they didn't care, but they were not really willing to. They didn't have the confidence to kind of come engage and kind of feel like, okay, I can come talk to these adults. I mean, that was it. I mean, they might have been watching us from the parking lot or whatever, but they wouldn't come up to that bus, and that was kind of an issue. And we could never get adults to come out in any number and volunteer and be part of this. And some of it, I think, is kind of the civic engagement. Some of it is, like I said, the non-traditional hours. Some of it is the language barriers. But all these kinds of things worked against us to getting adults. But like I said, the money was easy. It was always hard to get adults, to get people to kind of participate. So we had a lot of volunteers. Basically, like I said, it started out kind of a soccer program, but the kids in Camden that we work with, they didn't necessarily come for the soccer. We could have been doing lawn darts or doing, whatever. We could have done anything. They came because there were these caring, consistent adults that showed up every week, that knew their name, and that they felt that they mattered to, right? Because we knew their names, and we could joke with them, and we showed up every week, and that's, I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of what we have to do, but we had to show up every week. We had to keep coming every week, and that was the hard part, to show up every week, rain or sun, whether it was cold or hot. We had to show up because that's what the kids really came to rely on. That's what they didn't get enough of in the programs that they did have. And for example, in the middle school that I worked at, East Camden Middle School, in the budget, there was something like $60 per student that was given for co-curricular, extracurricular activities. $60. It's not very much. In Cherry Hill, I said, a couple miles away geographically, but a world away, there's something like $300 given per kid in Cherry Hill. In Cherry Hill, they didn't need that $300. Their parents, there was a whole world outside of school activities that these kids could participate in, but still, it was a five-fold difference in terms of how much was put into that, and that went to after-school clubs and after-school teams and bands and all these kind of trips that they would take, but there's this huge kind of disparity right there, and it really always struck me that, wow, it's just these kids, and the co-curricular was so important in my life. Sometimes that was the only thing that was kind of getting me to school. And these kids, it's kind of the same thing, is that this co-curricular part, this extracurricular part is so important, and it's taken for granted so much in these communities. And so what we tried to do in STAR program was, right, do the co-curricular part. Give these kids what we kind of felt wasn't occurring within the schools. And so we would do community service, do tree plantings, lupus walks, give turkeys out every Thanksgiving, which kids love to do. And what was so remarkable about the turkey drive we did every Thanksgiving, the Saturday before every Thanksgiving, was that some of the families that were given turkeys to were the kids that were given the turkeys were poorer than the families that were getting the turkeys. These kids loved it. The kids in our program loved being able to do something where they're actually going, knocking on the door, and doing something for somebody else. And we'd always have a huge turnout for kids to do that, and it always felt kind of good. And you could see that the families loved the idea that this was coming from kids in their community, and the kids in the community were able to engage, bless you, and be part of something so positive. And the kids loved it also. So we did these kinds of activities, reading clubs and backpacking, and like I said, the trip to Vermont. What we tried to prevent are what most programs try to prevent in terms of crime and premature parenthood, things like that, injuries, high school dropout. But what we tried to promote in these programs, obviously physically healthy kids who are going to be capable of work, kids that are thoughtful and reflective, caring and ethical, kids that are civically engaged. The civic engagement piece was something that we really tried to figure out how can we kind of connect them to communities and have communities connect to them, this back and forth. And we were able to do kinds of interesting things in the program. We actually got some money from different sources, and the kids participated in some research projects. The kids participated in also some outreach projects where they went door to door. And when the state children's health insurance program came out, New Jersey had a program called New Jersey Kid Care, and so the families would be able to receive low or no-cost health insurance. But they required that they fill out some forms. A lot of families were having trouble filling out the forms. But we trained these kids from the community, kids from Camden. We trained them to go door to door, and they went door to door, and they helped families get enrolled in New Jersey Kid Care. And so it was this opportunity to kind of be civically engaged, and it was really obviously gratifying for them, but also gratifying for the families that were able to kind of get health insurance. So those were the kinds of things that we tried to promote. Now, I also want to acknowledge, though, and I'm sure you as researchers are very aware, we really, programs at work really are very resource intense. And we're only going to get modest kind of program impacts. So we just kind of keep that in the back of our mind. And we saw that too. I mean, we had some great success stories with kids. We had some kids that were able to go to college, some kids that now are those kind of healthy, constructive adults. They're able to make a difference. The problem, I mean, one of the problems is that, our success stories, and I think this is really important for these communities, our success stories leave. They leave Camden. When they make it, and you can't blame them for it, they have to get out. There's not going, I lived in Camden. When I worked as a school nurse, I bought a house in Camden. As soon as we had our first kid, my wife was like, we're out of here. And yeah, she was right. What were we going to do? I knew too much about the schools to think I was going to send my kids to the schools. I can't make them martyr for the kind of beliefs or political beliefs that I had. But the same thing happens with these kids that make it. And the downside of that is that the kids that stay don't get to see these kids that made it, the kids that did it, because they're gone. And so they kind of, we have this kind of creaming where they're gone. And so it looks like, nobody ever makes it out of here. Oh, they make it. You just forgot about them. They're gone. I mean, because we see them. I mean, I see them, but they're not living in Camden. And I think that's kind of one of the downsides. And it's kind of a problem. I don't know if we can do much about that, but I think it is important to kind of, as Allison pointed out, think about the success stories and talk about those stories and make sure kids know that, kids do make it out of here. I mean, kids that do go to school and make it through. And one of the things that used to drive me crazy as a school nurse is we have, obviously, like most high poverty districts, we have a huge high school dropout rate. But what drove me crazy in this one high school is that in the beginning of the school year, there would be, first day, classrooms were overcrowded, right? Not enough books, not enough desks. And we're like, well, why is that? And we're like, well, the administration said, well, kids are going to drop out. And so it became this self-fulfilling prophecy where we didn't have enough books, enough desks for the kids to stay. We expected them to drop out. I mean, that becomes kind of like the criminal part where we're actually we're waiting for them to drop out. And of course they're going to drop out. We don't have enough books for them or desks. And it's just like, oh my goodness, this is a crazy, kind of crazy thing that we set up. So anyway, I don't want to get too far off topic. In terms of thinking about what works, we have to really kind of think about multiple domains, and these kind of caring adult-youth relationships really can create important opportunities for kids. Having adults to whom kids matter, that they know their name, that they're able to make a connection, because every kid clicks with different adults in different ways, and so the more adults that they can have in their lives, we know they're important. And we know also from developmentally, kids don't hang out with their parents after they start to reach adolescence. They spend more time with peers, and they spend time with non-parental adults. Unfortunately, places like Camden, there are fewer non-parental adults to hang out with. They're just spending time with their peers. But we know that. We know we need year-round involvement. We need skill development. We need structured curriculums. And so again, we have some evidence to suggest that these one-to-one adult adolescent relationships with adults, this mentoring can be very important. We know it can increase college attendance, reduce problem behaviors. It's really key that there's some shared interests. We don't actually need to have racial ethnic matching. All right, it's great if we can, but we don't have to have that. Kids will connect with anybody. And the kids will connect with anybody. If they show an interest, kids will connect, and we found that. But the other piece of it is that what the adults bring to the table is they bring their social networks. And so we had adults that came in, and the adults were able to kind of bring in, oh, you're interested in kind of finance, maybe I can get you a job at a bank, and these kinds of things happen. These things just occurred. It wasn't necessarily structured that you had to say this was going to happen, but there's a back and forth, and then all of a sudden, they're kind of bringing their resources. And these kids are living in places where we know them to be kind of cut off, right? We know that they're not able to tap into these kinds of social networks. So that's important also what the adults bring. We also know there has to be some sort of skill development. You have to get something, the engagement, and can get something out of it that's actually kind of tangible. They're learning something, and these kids do want to learn. They crave learning, and I think we really want to find opportunities for them to engage. And so, for example, in that program, we were able to have them go door to door and enroll families in New Jersey Kid Care. We got some kids interested in healthcare. We got some kids interested in kind of politics and things like that. So, skill development is important. One kind of skill that we kind of focused on our program with things like outdoor education, skill development, really good evidence suggests that stressing kids out, putting a backpack on them, having them hike up a mountain, they hate it while they're doing it, but at the end of the thing, we know that actually kind of, it's great. It's great for them. I mean, they actually kind of develop a higher sense of confidence, and they're better off in the long run. So our kids always hated these hikes that we would do, but they also secretly loved them. So, so we know that these kinds of things diminish problem behavior and then to promote adolescent development. So these are really kinds of important. Pro-social development, obviously we want kids to have opportunities to kind of engage with communities and be part of communities and do things positive to communities. I think what happens, and a lot of times the kids are just so cut off that the adults that are in these communities that have so many kids in them, they're in a weird position also because they're hearing more of the things that adolescents do. I mean, the reality of adolescents are, right, they don't always make the best choices with kind of hygiene or the language that they use. It can be hard, right? And it can be hard to be around adolescents a lot, and they're louder. So these adults in communities that are surrounded by kids are kind of bombarded by this, and they're like, oh my God, kids are terrible. Which doesn't necessarily happen in kind of affluent communities where there are fewer kids. I mean, there's fewer kids, and so you're seeing fewer of the kind of problem behaviors. But these adults that are in these communities that have so many kids are sometimes kind of bombarded. So yeah, community service, whether they volunteer to do it, whether it's required, we have good evidence to suggest that they get a benefit of it. So even when we require kind of community service, it's good. What doesn't work? As I said, mentoring works. It's important. We really think, but mentoring that is less than 6 months long is not a great thing. So we actually have some evidence to suggest that Big Brothers, Big Sisters kind of programs where college students do it and they kind of check out after a semester, it's not really what we want to be doing. And so we have to kind of really look at that and think about, how do we do the mentoring? It's important in terms of the context. So, kind of keep that in mind in terms of, what works. Another thing we don't want to do is aggregate deviant peers. We don't want to take a whole bunch of kids that are having trouble and then have them hang with other kids who have trouble, because we know we get kids that they learn a lot from each other, right? Kids do learn from each other. And so if they get a new audience, that they can tell, this is how I did this car, or this is how I sold this, or, they kind of like, well, that's something I can think about doing down the road. And so we have to be very careful with how we take kids and who we're putting them with, because that's going to have an influence. So these boot camp opportunities, not a great idea, and we kind of know that from the research. So we have to kind of think about that also. And I think these kind of boot camp ideas feel good to people, right? Take kids, we'll run them around the woods, we'll make them, really kind of, we'll have people yell at them. There used to be TV shows on that showing that kind of craziness. But, right, it's probably a bad idea. And you can kind of also see that in communities where adults are looking at kids, with so many kids, they look at them as a problem to be managed, right? It's a problem to manage. Let's get midnight basketball. Let's get curfews. Let's just get these kids somewhere because the kids are the problem. So let's kind of treat that problem and make sure we're doing something to keep tabs on these kids because they're a problem. Now, in communities like Cherry Hill and places like that, where there are more adults, the adults have more resources. I think we have the luxury of kind of saying, these kids are a resource. And if we can structure it enough, if we have enough adults that can kind of structure the opportunities, we can use them as a resource, and we can make the community better, and we can make them better in the long run. It's kind of this back and forth that everybody kind of wins if we can do that. But again, it's the adults, and I think kind of one of our challenges is we're not going to change the age structure of these communities, right? We're not going to be able to come out and take kids out of the community. That's not going to happen. But how do we kind of put the resources in the community to kind of make the differences that we want to see, and the kind of differences that were in your lives, that was in my life when I was growing up. I mean, I had people in my life that cared about me, and that made a huge difference. right? And so how can we do that in these communities? So again, we really want kids that are problem-free. I mean, I think we always think of that, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily fully prepared. So we want kids that are going to be healthy and achieve these kind of constructive adulthoods. And that's really kind of what we're trying to do, is not just prevent problems, but have kids that are prepared to go on and make a difference. Because these communities in places like Camden, and East St. Louis, and Atlantic City, and North Philadelphia, and all these communities, we need these adolescents, these young adults, to develop the skills to make a difference in their communities and make a difference in the lives of their kids. Right, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of warm, consistent, caring adults who are able to kind of connect with them and able to kind of model and show them the resources and give them the kind of connections they're going to need to make those kind of differences. So I thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Shirley, for inviting me to give a few closing comments here. Thank you, I think. I hope you're all feeling a little sorry for me, having to follow Shirley and Allison and Robert. I'm in awe. I'm inspired by your presentations. I'm supposed to give you a charge? Aren't you all charged up already? Wow. Awesome. Thank you so much. I come here not as someone working in the law or someone working in schools. I'm a researcher, and I work with adults. Okay, and Robert pointed out how important adults are in all that we do. And Allison certainly pointed that out also in her remarks. I got started on my journey, and I just want to tell you a little bit. The way I want to give you a charge is to just tell you how I got a little bit of a charge as a very small, humble example of what I want to implore you all to go out and do. I got my charge doing a longitudinal study of high school dropouts over about a 10-year period. Where I followed them to see what happened to them. And I started with lots of stereotypes that I didn't even think I had as I followed them with a large team of students and colleagues. We followed them wherever they went over that period of time. One of the things, besides losing stereotypes, one of the things I saw was how constrained they were by their life circumstances, how resilient some were, how challenged others were. And I felt like I'd learned things that I'd been hearing for decades, finally. Certainly I'd heard it for decades and decades of AERA meetings that I went to. But as Allison told us, and others have pointed out in the conference, poverty isn't going away. Economic segregation isn't decreasing in our country. So what's all the research we're doing, that I was doing, that other people are doing? How is it actually getting traction and making a difference? So I started into a series of projects with my colleague Jill Kastick, who's here in the audience, and our colleagues in Portland and across the country to try and go out and do something. And one of the things we tried to do was a digital literacy project. Because of the digital marginalization we saw in poor communities that was actually increasing, not decreasing, as technology got better. And so we went out and found a network of colleagues in 6 states, and we developed a software platform called LearnerWeb, and our idea was to work with community partners to introduce technology and the support of community volunteers. And that sounds really easy, right? Just add water and stir, I think. Robert pointed out how hard it is to find adults and volunteers in, economically disadvantaged communities, and that was certainly the case. We didn't do it. We had community partners, schools, libraries, churches, and so forth. They did the work. They had to figure out how to do it. We started in about 60 places, and we've probably gotten to 125 by now. It's expanding, not because of what we're doing, but because of the organizations and the communities we're working through. But if you follow poverty, it will take you to places you didn't necessarily think you were going to go. Pretty soon, our program migrated into incarcerated settings in 4 of the communities we were working in. And that wasn't something we had contemplated. We didn't think anything based on internet could ever get into an incarcerated setting. But these communities found a way of doing that. And one of them was in New Orleans, and there we've wound up with about 800 people going through a reentry program, becoming somewhat digitally literate, who had never used computers before, because, if you've been in prison a long time, the world has changed and digitized while you were waiting. Of course, while you're doing time, your family's doing time also, and that's a big part of this. I can't go on and tell you much about that, but I would like to just note that the Times-Picayune, the newspaper in New Orleans, in the last few weeks has run a series of articles illustrating how New Orleans is the prison capital of the world. And we can't really, in communities like New Orleans, talk about poverty or race without talking about incarceration. 1 out of 14 adult males in New Orleans is incarcerated. If you look at the percentage of youth who are incarcerated, it's even much higher. I don't want to dwell on this, but there is an urgent need for us to get out there as researchers and understand what's going on in the field, on the ground, in these communities, and try to help people like Allison and Robert with their work. And I think we can do that. You can do that. We all have to go out there and do that. Poverty is dragging our country down. It's holding us back. We all know that. We don't need more research demonstrating that. We need research showing us how to change it. And that's the charge I want to offer you. I think we need to think about education, in the words of the poet William Butler Yeats. It's not about filling a bucket, folks. It's about lighting a fire. And I want you to go out there and light some fires, and let's find some programs that work, and let's get rid of poverty as it's currently seen. So thank you very much, Allison and Robert and Shirley. And I think we have a few minutes left for discussion in the session, if anyone wants to do that.
I want to commend our speakers for being so on time. I think I had paralyzed them with fear. And so I know that they took the mic away, but I suspect all of you, if you have a question, you can either voice it from the floor, or we'll be here for you to address questions to Allison, Robert, and Steve. But if anyone has a question, please rise. And someone is coming with a mic. This is an amazing team. Here he is. You don't want him to have his efforts wasted. So are there questions or proposals or ideas or projects underway we need to know about?
Hi, my name's Donna Linderman. I'm with the City University of New York. University Associate Dean, I oversee the CUNY ASAP program, which is an accelerated associate degree program at 6 of our community colleges. I actually had a question for Robert, or actually any of you could answer this.
Robert?
You talked about the fact that the type of program that you were running in Camden is resource intensive. And I'm curious, when we think about sort of the larger cost to the local community in Camden or any of the communities you mentioned, when you think about incarceration, other aspects of unengaged youth and then adults, what do you think some of the barriers are in a city like Camden to the local school board and the city government, the mayor's office, for example, not increasing, for example, that co-curricular line item in the budget? I'm just curious, when the larger costs are taken into account in a particular community, what do you think the barriers are to increasing some of the funding and resources that would be needed to expand programs like the one you ran?
Is that Mike Live? Yeah.
That's a great question. And I do think it's part of kind of what I think we touched on today, in that I don't think there's this acknowledgement of the importance of, and Allison talked about taking out the security guards and putting in the art teachers, but the importance of the opportunities to engage in co-curricular things that aren't necessarily they're not going to be tested on. I think there's so much focus on that we have to kind of get there in school and make sure that we're drilling them, make sure we focus on that, and we're kind of forgetting about all these kinds of things that occur alongside or outside of school that are so important. We're so important in, I'm sure, each of your lives, important in my life. But it's just kind of, I think it just gets lost in the conversation. And so much of the conversation is around, how long are we going to make the school day, and are we going to wear uniforms, and are we going to, what are we going to feed these kids? We're not really kind of thinking about how we're going to kind of feed their kind of extracurricular lives, which can be so important. And then kind of tie them more into the school. I mean, we have evidence suggests that when kids do get more, are more connected to the school, we are going to get better academic outcomes. But I kind of think it just gets lost, and we kind of forget, because we do, I think, have such a segregation in terms of class segregation, that there's just not enough of this conversation. So no, this is important, and we are going to make this a priority.
Other questions? Yes. Here.
Thank you so much. My name is Leah Saul. I'm from Louisiana State University. We have a lot of the problems that have been highlighted today. For those of us who are doing social justice related research, what are the publication outlets that you would recommend us to get out of our ivory towers and get to you or to the people?
So thank you for that question. The Civil Rights Project, as you may know, is doing a lot of very important research and is developing a research to practice pipeline. So they're certainly looking for research, and they are developing some really cutting edge data and information that they are literally taking and putting into the hands of advocates, and then working collaboratively to make it work. And then, I think there's a lot of research in neuroscience and cognitive development that's happening and that's coming out around poverty, and intersecting that and making sure that advocates know that that's happening, and that the brain is a very important thing to study. And so Frontiers is one that is accessible. It's not kind of in the JSTOR locked away category. And the NIH is also doing some really important work around cognitive development and poverty. In terms of just kind of overall social science and advocacy work, I think, the Advancement Project is doing some really great work in that area also, and they have a lot of resources available online. And Ivory Toldson is at the Journal for Negro Higher Education out of Howard University, and is also doing some great research there.
I want to mention also that both of our speakers have very generously said that they would be willing to put their slides on out there for you. And Allison, if you will add to your slides the points you just made in terms of the Civil Rights Project, so that people can tap into adding to those free sources. And she also mentioned the National Center for Children in Poverty, which is a vital source for all of us to keep keep up with. It changes week by week by week. Final question? Brian?
Hi, thank you very much indeed. My name is Brian Street. I work mostly in England, although I also teach at the University of Pennsylvania. I'd like to raise at the end, and you won't have time to answer it, but to signal the international dimension here. I work quite a lot with colleagues in UNESCO, in international work, and Shirley does quite a lot of that kind of thing as well. Next year, the Millennium Development Goals are being revised. They're very narrow, and we're trying to broaden them so they take account of exactly the sort of things you're talking about. And I'd like to just ask how far and in what ways the work going on in the US is pushing away at these more international dimensions that the United Nations, the Millennium Development Goals, UNESCO are concerned with as well. Thank you.
It's yours.
So I appreciate that question. Also, I have been trying to do some bridging of gaps between international advocates and domestic, and making sure that people know that although the United States is not necessarily a signatory to some of the most important international treaties out there that ensure equity for children across race and ethnicity and poverty lines, that there is still some very important work happening in the world that we have to pay attention to, certainly as advocates and definitely as researchers, so that we can know as we're developing remedies for school districts that organizations like the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, it has developed minimum standards for what education should look like in crisis situations, and we have children in very similar situations in this country who are experiencing trauma on a daily basis and need supports in their schools. So things like that are happening, certainly not as fast as I would like to see, but I think people are certainly open and willing to think about outside of the law and the legal structure and the United States reluctance to be a part of that global community, just how we can make sure that we are reflecting what's happening in the world and that we're ensuring the same protections that global entities are.
Again, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your session, and remember to take a walk occasionally so that you don't feel that you're totally over brimming with ideas and promotion. But I hope you go away from this with the idea that there are outlets, that there are certain kinds of studies, and that we all have to do it, and we have to recruit others to do it. I think most of us know that now what has happened is our education research is very much like the creative journals, and particularly those in poetry. We've known for years there are far more poets submitting poems for publication than there are poets reading poetry. The same is true for fiction. The same is now true for education research. And what we now have in this session, I hope, is the promotion for all of us to know that there are outlets where people will be able to take that work and act and put it into, as you were saying, into advocacy organizations such as community associations, such as prison reforms, prison education reforms. And so let's go. We're charged. Thank you again.